It'll say live. All right, and we are live. Hello, everyone. This is Jacob Glanville. I have here with me Stephanie and Aishani. You guys want to introduce yourself?
Hello. My name is Stephanie Wisner. I work with Centivax on business and operations.
Hi, I'm Aishani. I work primarily in computational immunoengineering, but also help with some of the policy and communications pieces of our work on COVID-19 as well.
Cool. And today I'm joining you al fresca because they're doing work in my apartment. So we were trying to figure out what we would talk about this week. And in general, we've been trying to share different shards of the business and the process of making a medicine. And one big part of that is the financial aspect. So what we thought would be kind of cool is to spend some time today, the three of us, discussing the kind of two big parts of money in medicine. The first is, how do you pay for this stuff? So how have we gone forward with financing the development and preclinical and then clinical for our antibody therapeutic? And how does that compare to, say, peacetime out of a COVID crisis? And how does that compare to how other companies do this? I think it's, we'll give you some of the behind the scenes on our bumpy ride through this process, which hopefully you'll find interesting. And it kind of naturally flows into the second half of the conversation, which is how much do people charge for medicine? I saw there was a lot of, let's say, excitable feedback around the pricing that was decided upon by Gilead for remdesivir. So I think that gives rise to a question, because they're related, is how you raise the money for a company ends up influencing how much the people who gave you that money want back. And so we'll talk about that as well, and sort of a general strategy that we have in Centivax for a different charging model and some of the challenges that are inherent to that. Does that sound good to everybody?
That sounds great.
All right, so let's kick off. I thought I'd give a little bit of a background on where we are so far, and then just everyone jump in. I've just had coffee, so I'm going to talk too much and too fast, so just cut me off.
Go for it. I got mine right here.
So I still have mine here. So here's where we are so far, and here's where we're going. So our initial discovery of our antibody therapeutics for COVID-19 were supported by Distributed Bio. So this is the company that I co-founded in 2012. And that company never had venture. What it had were a series of contracts with other companies. So a whole bunch of pharmas, like 50 plus, have come to us, and we engineer antibodies for them, and we charge them for that. And so because I didn't have venture, I was not obligated through this thing called fiduciary duty you're going to hear a lot about today, to go keep all that money or hand it back out to the investors or whatever. So I had the luxury to reinvest it into internal programs that I thought were interesting. And the COVID-19 project was one of those. So in January, when the outbreak was starting to get pretty scary, I realized that we had the kind of means, motive, and opportunity to produce an antibody. We had all the tools at our disposal that produce these antibodies really fast, and a cool new way to adapt anti-SARS antibodies. And we had the working resources. We were making enough money from our contracts that we could basically float this project in with all the others, and Distributed Bio would essentially subsidize the work. So that's how it was done initially, to basically pay for, it was a few $100,000 of the engineering work and the people's time and the facilities. So up next, we needed to be able to pay for the preclinical work. So that's the neutralization assays and the hamster studies that we just did a press release on. And for that, things get more expensive, and my partners are getting a little bit more gun shy about me venting out a bunch of money out of DBio. So we did two things. One was we reached out to governments, and I think you've heard us say we thought government should pay for this stuff because it's so much cheaper to pay for a medicine than to constantly hand out, billions lost to the economy and handing out subsidies to people. It's kind of like if you have an arterial bleed in your arm, you're just like mopping the floor rather than putting a bandage on it. One of those makes more sense than the other, because you're going to be mopping that floor for a while. So that one approach was talking to government, and we are deeply appreciative. We got an MTech grant to help us with the preclinical work from MTech, US AMRID, so it's Department of Defense, which is fantastic. But we definitely got way less than I thought. I went into this somewhat naive, and I was like, oh, government's definitely going to pay for this thing. Like, this is a crisis. And that has not happened. It's actually been way harder than I was expecting. Some some confusing developments. We're still talking with BARDA and the Joint Task Force and some other groups in government. But at this point, I have not received that resources, and we've reached the point where I can't rely on government to solve that problem. So we're looking in a couple other areas. One of them was people kept asking us, hey, like, can I donate? So we put a donate button up on Centivax.com, and we didn't really advertise it, but we ended up getting like 40 plus nations. There's like over 1,000 people donated, and that money was like super helpful. We ended up using that to help the neutralization assays. We ran them at 5 labs. Some of those labs didn't charge us, and some of them had to charge us something, and we used some of that money. We also used some of it for the hamster studies that in theory will get paid back by government, but in the meantime, we needed to pay for them somehow. And the donations from you guys are what made that possible. So I was super appreciative. If you want to help us somehow, you can. If you haven't donated, if you can afford it, donate a little bit. Otherwise, just spread the word. It's Centivax.com and amplify the message for us, and you'd be helping us out. I think that money helps us at preclinical. The next steps, I think, it's unrealistic to think that donations and crowdsourcing is going to get there, because we're talking about like $8 million to be able to cover all the manufacturing through IgG. And it's unrealistic that we're going to get that from crowdsourcing. So for there, and if government gives us the money, that's great, but we're also turning our attention to partnerships with pharma. And maybe Stephanie will talk a little bit about some of the benefits and then, the risks about partnering with pharma. But in general, we think that's a pretty good strategy. We've also been reached out to by a lot of venture capitalists. That is what venture is good at, is mobilizing money quickly in some cases. But there's also some challenges around freedom for, what we would be able to charge for the medicine and so forth. And then there's been private people who've reached out as well. So we're starting to consider all of these things, because at this point we are in manufacturing and we need to basically have a plan for that. And then also clinical studies, which are like $30+ million, so $40 million. So these are the big ticket items that are getting outside of the realm of, like, unless the whole world starts giving us money, we need to look at these other sources. So, I mean, Stephanie, just threw it at you. You want to jump in on this?
Well, what comes to mind for me is just giving some clarity around why drug prices are typically so high, just so that people can understand that a little bit. And so I think that comes mainly from 2 different things. So the first one is just this concept of needing to recoup years and years of R&D costs. And those are typically the arguments you hear with all the drug pricing debate that's going on in Capitol Hill right now. People normally make arguments around how if you're spending 10 years researching a drug and pouring in resources to that, in the 10-year window you then have of your drug patent life after that to sell the drug, you have to make sure you're actually making a profit margin to justify the fact that you spent 10 years of resources developing this drug. So that's one part of it. And when you're a large pharma company and you're putting in a lot of money into overhead and a lot of money into a lot of different people's salaries, you just have higher operating expenses, and you need to recoup that in your short window of time. So that leads to higher prices. Another reason that we can use Gilead as an example in remdesivir, a lot of the reason that pharma chooses such high prices is because they're also thinking about it from the perspective of what your next best alternative is. So with remdesivir, they're thinking about it like, okay, so if we're getting a patient out of the hospital 3 days early, that means we're saving three times the daily cost of keeping a patient in the hospital. And then they're charging the drug probably about half of what that would cost, or more than half. But they start to think about it relative to how much they're saving people. And while $3,000 is definitely not affordable for the average person, their argument would be that that is saving people money. But Centivax and distributed bio, we're not thinking about it that way. We're really thinking about it as how we can help the most people and make a sustainable profit margin, but a profit margin that is potentially smaller than a larger pharma company could go after. And the reason we can do that is really just because we have managed to keep those overhead costs low and the company size small, which means that we can recoup those costs a lot more efficiently than a big pharma can.
Yeah.
Stephanie, a question that typically comes up, particularly with the Gilead example in remdesivir, is that the government funded that R&D because it was in a comparable crisis. So what is the rationale in a situation like that? That's a question that typically comes up, and maybe you want to address that too.
That's a great question. I might be getting the name of the law wrong, but I think it was called the Bayh-Dole Act or the Bayh-Dole Act. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. But that essentially gave private businesses the right to commercialize government-funded intellectual property. So after that was passed, private businesses are able to do that. And the argument there, not saying that, this is where we stand by any means, but the argument that allowed that law to pass was just that, okay, well, if there's not a commercial incentive, then no one's going to develop this. So that's why they're able to do that. But here at Centivax, our IP was developed, as Jake said, in-house at Distributed Bio. So we don't have that sort of origin story, which is great.
So I'll share a couple ideas on these fronts with how we're trying to structure this. And some of these ideas have just been born from watching kind of our experience in industry. So to riff off of what Stephanie was saying, yeah, part of the challenge with large pharmaceutical companies is that they have huge expenditures. So, if you have 30,000 employees, and let's say you're paying each person, let's just round it to $100,000 each on average, and it takes you years to build a drug, you're going to have to basically only be able to survive on a metabolism of blockbusters. You can't even afford to work on things that aren't blockbusters. That's the fundamental problem with neglected tropical diseases. It's not that you can't make money, it's just that those types of medicines aren't attractive enough to such a beast. It needs to be able to have just huge blockbusters to pay the bills because of the number of people. So my solution to that is really something I watched the industry start to do, which is there's this selective downsizing happening in large pharma. And what's happening is there's this growth of an ecology of a bunch of little contract research organizations, and now larger ones, that can carry out a bunch of the functions that used to be, you had this like central castle, and that's where all the research that could possibly be conducted needed to be done in-house at like your Genentechs and your Pfizers. But as increasingly those kinds of research tasks became commoditized, and really in many cases they got better because you have someone that's their full job is doing that one thing, rather than some department in a big pharma who suddenly took on that responsibility and have to spend 2 years getting good at that thing. It made more sense for these big pharmas to start downsizing and outsourcing some of those responsibilities. That's what Distributed Bio does. Actually, it's pharmas, rather than trying to go in-house, they're like, these guys are really good at making antibodies. Let's just hire them. That way we don't have to have our own department. And that's let these companies try to reduce the number of employees and their overhead. But the problem is they kind of like blew up. Once you're already huge, it's hard, it's hard to lose weight once you've gained it, right? That's the problem that is being faced by these massive metabolisms. And my feeling is a new generation of biotechs, mine included, ours included, but also many of my clients are small biotechs, and they're operating on this kind of pseudo virtual or completely virtual model, where what they really are is a think tank of project managers, and people are coming up with ideas, and they're strategically having outsourced partners take care of the specific tasks. And the power of that is your overhead is radically different. Like, our intention is to never grow huge with Centivax. There's no reason why we should ever have 30,000 employees. I think we should never even have 3,000 employees. And the value of that is that suddenly that's a business that can operate on making medicines that are profitable, but they don't have to be blockbusters. So that's part of the strategy. The other part is kind of contemplating more of a forward model rather than the luxury model for therapeutics. So the cost of goods of an antibody is about $100 a gram, and that's not an unreasonable dose for a number of applications. So let's assume it's about $100 a dose. But what people are typically charged it depends on indication. For cancer, they charge $8,000. If it's for like autoimmunity, they charge $3,000. So that already tells you a little bit about what Stephanie's talking about. They're trying to decide how much they gouge people by how critical the disorder is, which is messed up. But what they're doing is, you can see that all that's corporate profit on top of the cost of goods, and there's obviously you need to pay for people to like distribute it and do things, right? But it doesn't need to be this crazy overage. We can make a working business. And I'm always asking myself, I grew up in a hotel and a restaurant, and I always ask myself, like, what does it take to be as good as a restaurant, right? And like, can we make, for our anti-venom program, for instance, like, we can definitely make that profitable. Neglected tropical disease does not mean there's no money in it. It just means there's not a huge amount. But if you make your costs lower, then you can charge less and you can still make money. And so I think that is a viable route forward. And particularly in this COVID crisis, there's no reason to charge a lot because there's going to be huge numbers of doses here. So if you have a reasonable profit on each one, like let's say we make $100 per dose, right? Then that's suddenly a drug that would you add on distribution and all that other stuff, and it's still going to cost less than an iPhone for life-saving therapy. The whole world can afford it, and the company would still do well. Like all my numbers are, you know, you're not making billions, but you're like that thing would make. They probably would make over $100 million, probably more to be blunt, depending on how many hospitals adopted it. And I think that's really the difference of strategy. Part of the challenge is that there's this fiduciary duty, which says that like officers of a corporation, it's their job to go make money for the shareholders. And so if you do things that are going against that, in theory, they can actually file a claim against you and say, you're not doing your job. Your job is to make me as much money as possible. And that's a dangerous thing to have. You can either articulate it in two ways. One is you can say the Ford model where you're like, no, this actually is going to blow up. You just have to trust me. This is a business strategy. And the other one is you can basically avoid taking on financial responsibilities where you're forced into that scenario. Stephanie, you're actually the one who kind of brought this to my attention. At one point. Thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think you explained it really well. Typically, the reason you have board members is to represent the interests of the shareholders, which is what happens in a public company. It's Distributed Bio is a private company, and Jake is on the board, but he also, is a shareholder in the company. His interests are aligned with, theoretically, the benefit of the shareholders. So I think what he's trying to say is that by separating those interests between, Jake's promise and his commitment to keeping prices affordable with an obligation to board members that are, supposed to be legally interested in a profit margin, you have conflicting interests there. And so that's led us to get very creative about alternative funding mechanisms, and has led us to be a little bit slow to pursue funding routes more traditionally taken by biotech ventures, such as venture capital. And that's not to say that there's no place for venture capital in biotech, but that's just to say with our business model, it is not very well aligned. And so at this moment, we, haven't taken it.
We may end up having to, and in the end, we're one way or another, we're going to make the medicine move forward, and that might be the way to do it. I think the challenge is going to be, we would need to take on partners who'd be willing, with very carefully documented and aware of our strategy, that we're going to make money. I don't believe in doing things. It's not charity. I think actually, I don't. If you sell at cost, your business will fail, because I will tell you, getting grants is a pain in the ass. It's a terrible way to run a business. It takes too long, and you're at the constant mercy of people who you're not even in a room with to articulate your ideas to, and it's slow. So I do want to make enough money to keep the engines of war turning here. And really, if we can make a working therapy for COVID, first off, it lets lets the world get back to work, and it protects us, which is huge. But it also, that becomes a self-fulfilling engine of profitability, so that we can basically build whatever the hell we want in the future, and we don't have to go through these, this sort of existential corporate angst cycle of, priming the pump. But with VCs, if we bring them on, they need to be okay with that, and they need to be okay with a certain level of profitability. But the idea is we would, and the way I would articulate it is that we need to be okay with making some money, but not a huge amount in the COVID crisis. But that would create goodwill and arm the company with revenue, so that we'd be able to develop additional assets in the future. And I think that's an option, but again, there's a misalignment there, and I get it. And VCs have done a lot of good to help create a lot of good medicines. But here, they're going to have to ask, is it worth me investing here as opposed to in an oncology thing where I may get a greater short-term return? And I think that's the question we'd want to articulate. That's why we're also contemplating pharmaceutical partners. So Stephanie's been the one pushing on this hard, and she's right. So we have, from Pfizer, from Pfizer, Boehringer Ingelheim, Gilead, Teva, and all these other big companies and small companies that we've worked with, we have a pretty big portfolio of relationships, and many of these companies are our clients at DBio. So we've started reaching out to a bunch of them to see if they want to partner with us on our therapeutic. That could work well, but we will lose control over the pricing, which is again a concern unless that becomes a specific negotiated item. And I'm just guessing that the pharma lawyers are going to hate having an agreement which controls the pricing. All of this stuff is mute if governments pay for the drug. So I think for vaccines, they've been talking about subsidizing it. I haven't heard as much about I haven't heard the U.S. government say, yes, we're just going to cover all the costs of remdesivir, for instance. So I think that's an open question. And I think we're not going to charge $3,000 a dose. It's definitely going to be lower than that, but it's going to be higher than a vaccine. And so I think that becomes a question of how much can we price it so that many different nations that have different policies, all of those nations have an affordable medicine that they could take. Ashani, I haven't roped you in yet.
Yeah, no, a couple things to add right there. I think that's a lot of really interesting and important stuff. And on the point of the vaccine and how the government is subsidizing it, there have been more and more conversations recently congressionally as to what specifically that looks like, because that money has to come from somewhere, even if it's from the government. And that typically ends up being taxpayers, especially when it's a solution that's so broad-based and at a population level rather than for specific subsets of the population. So even though the focus until now has been primarily on funding research, now the conversation is shifting a little bit to distribution and manufacturing and how exactly that specifically pans out. So definitely the details are becoming more important as time goes on, and vaccines are just one piece of the puzzle. There's also the therapeutics front, which I think we can dive into a little bit more as to how that research has been funded so far, and then diagnostics and a lot of other smaller things in between. And then on the venture capital front, I think it's interesting to note, being a Silicon Valley based company, the culture of this area has definitely evolved over time. And I'd say particularly in the last 5 years, you've seen a lot more when it comes to deliberate culture, especially from venture capital, about, people first investing. And that kind of plays off of how financial incentives work based off of how venture capital and biotech are structured as industries. Because if you look at, under-addressed tropical diseases, for example, part of the reason why they're under-addressed is your market size for that is significantly smaller. So there's less probability of reaping large profits. And when you're a large pharmaceutical company, then that's not as attractive of a target. And that does misalign incentives to an extent. And especially when you also consider that with when you have a successful drug, or if you have a successful preventative measure, you shrink your market size over time, the healthier people get. That really speaks to how the healthcare industry is structured, especially in the United States in general. Typically, you go to the doctor and then you go to another doctor, and once you're in the system, it's very hard to get out. But I think COVID-19 and this pandemic as a crisis is really a unique opportunity, because this problem needs to be solved. And that kind of is destroying a lot of previously existing boundaries. Things are moving faster. Collaboration is more commonplace. There's a lot of sharing of information that previously wouldn't happen at a pace like this. And I think it's been really interesting just to see from a meta level how multiple subsets of industry have been evolving.
Yeah, I think, initially I just thought government was going to pay for it and it was going to be easy. So I focused on the engineering, and I was just like, the money's going to come, this is going to be easy. And I was wrong about that. This was, I think bureaucracies, and they're well-meaning people and they're working hard. The FDA has been super responsive with us, and we definitely appreciate the grant we got from MTech and USAMRIID and the DoD, and the national labs who've been helping us out have been phenomenal. But I just thought government would be like, you know what, we're losing so many billions per day. Let's just give these guys 50 million. Let's solve the problem now. And that didn't happen. And we're still talking, but at this point, I've shifted gears. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure this medicine gets in. And so we're actually firing on all cylinders right now. So we've been talking with multiple pharma companies. We're starting to talk to VC partners. There were a lot of people that reached out and offered to, they were asked if they could invest individually, but we're not IPO. So we haven't, an IPO is when you go and your company becomes available for public investment. And when you're pre-IPO, I think there's special rules that say we can only have 35 non-qualified investors. So we can't take hundreds of people investing a little bit into a company. There's special instruments that let us do things like that. But also I didn't want to take people, it's well-meaning and I appreciate it, but I think people offering me like $100 through the donation is great, but if people are talking about giving me $10,000, I want to make sure that this thing's going to be successful because that $10,000 might actually be a lot for that person. So it's kind of uncomfortable. Like one of my relatives offered to invest, and I was like, you know what, I'd rather make sure that we definitely have the $8 million to go through manufacturing, and then also the 40+ million to go through clinical before I'd feel comfortable taking my own family members' money at that scale. And I feel the same way for strangers. So that's sort of where we are. I think once you have things lined up and there's a route towards success, our unique opportunity is that we don't have 10 years of massive spend behind us. We built this thing with a couple $100,000 and we're getting a clean slate and we may be profitable quickly, which is kind of a remarkable opportunity to finish the job of what I always dreamed of, which is to be able to have essentially a financial directive and cool technologies behind us to start going after some of these cool markets like anti-venom and influenza, where we have contemplated other types of broad spectrum vaccines that I want to get some more data before we share with you, but they're pretty cool. That's sort of where we are right now. The pricing, I think, is a huge advantage for us. So it could complicate the conversations, but because it's such a crazy huge market, you know, you normally make an antibody, you're making it for like 100,000 people a year that have a special type of cancer, right? So it's a bespoke kind of luxury item. Whereas what we're talking about doing here is mass production of millions of doses. By my estimates, you could end up in the United States probably using 5,000 doses a day, and that's just in the United States. So it's a pretty big market of a large number of doses of a therapeutic, and that means you can charge less per dose and it could still be profitable. And I think that's going to be an advantage for us. So there are two advantages. Our disadvantage compared to established companies that have access to a lot of VC money and stuff is that they had existing partnerships and they had more early money. We're going to solve this next. Our advantage is going to be, first off, I think our therapeutics probably better. We don't have direct head-to-head data right now, but our in vivo data and some of our engineering that went into it leads me to believe it's going to be a better medicine. But that's a guess. But what I know for sure is that we're going to be able to charge less. And that means that we're going to have a bigger impact on the world with a medicine, provided we bring it to market. And so that is my headache right now, but also the promise of what we're working on is just lining those next steps up, because we are in manufacturing. So this is a train that's rolling forward, and we're just trying to like plan for the next bits. The last piece we've been doing is we've been reached out to by countries outside of the United States. And initially, our thought was like, let's just focus on the U.S. These are our primary like clinical partners. And we're working with the government, and the U.S. has so much money. Let's hit it here. The FDA's here, But we've been reached out to by Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and there are deep-pocketed groups that, first off, they have money, but they also have the ability to help us distribute, which is a problem that we need to solve as well. What I would find really would piss me off is if we had a medicine and it was working and we were only able to sell in the United States initially. That would be a failure of production. And so we're starting to have those conversations also. This is just to give you a sense, like if maybe you're hearing it, the engineering part in some respects was easy. This is now suddenly a lot of conversations going on all at once and a lot of contracting to try to figure out how do you plan for proving a product and then distributing it so the whole world can use it. So maybe Stephanie, question for you. With respect to the two different charge models, right? You have the one charge model, which is sort of commonly utilized when people are deciding how much to charge for medicine, which is basically how much does it hurt? It's basically saying, does the insurance agent, would the insurance group be willing to pay for this because it saves the insurance?
Absolutely. Yep, that's right.
Versus the alternative, which is just, okay, here's a cost of goods. How much profit do I want to make on top of it? And they're radically different because, like on one hand, you're hearing me say, well, if it costs me $100 to make it, and then it's like costs like everything of having all the people and the distribution chains and the percentage you're going to give to the person who's actually selling the thing, you add all that stuff up, that's another $100. So that's $200, and then you stack another $100 of profit on each dose. That's a $300 drug, just to make up some numbers.
Right. Right. It's really a difference between the minimal market penetration but high margin strategy and the maximal market penetration but lower margin strategy, and just assuming that you'd be able to make the same profit via scale and just by having more users. And for COVID, that does seem to be a viable route for us to take, because of course we want to make this affordable and available to everyone who needs it, without having to, sell your liver or something like that to pay for this thing. So thinking about it that way, I think you call it the Ford model. of pricing, but that would just be selling a lot of doses at a lower price point, but a price point that's still profitable for us.
Shawnee,
yeah, of note over there, if you look at remdesivir again, because that's the major example, that seems to be a drug that's only useful for patients with severe cases of COVID-19, which is a significantly smaller share of the market compared to a vaccine, for example, where you would be trying to preventatively help all sorts of individuals. That being said, obviously, there's a lot of other factors at play over there that make that a little bit more of an interesting and complicated case, but that is a way that reasoning has played out thus far, for example.
Yeah, that's a great example. And then something else I would say about the difference between us with a therapeutic and a vaccine is that it actually is a lot easier in building biotech companies to get insurance reimbursement and value recognition of the value you've created with your medicine when it's an acute therapeutic and not a prophylactic situation like with a vaccine. Usually uptake is easier and all of that, which isn't to say that vaccines and all of that aren't important, but typically that is kind of a business consideration that's thought about when you're thinking about how to penetrate markets. And it's just straight up easier to get people to take something when they're already sick, unfortunately, than it is for them to take something when they're healthy. So that's also something we actually have working to our advantage in this situation.
We've been writing this op-ed together. I'm sure you have a number of thoughts on that, of the vaccine. Anybody like kind of projections for the near future?
Yeah, I mean, Shawnee, do you want to talk about that since you took the lead on?
Sure, I have a little bit to add on that front. I think, especially in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of conversations around vaccines, especially as phase 1 safety data has been released and phase 3 trials are beginning for multiple groups. And, a vaccine is important when you look at the big picture strategy of managing this disease, because that's a viable route towards herd immunity. But that is something that is qualified by, number one, the efficacy of the vaccine. It's highly, highly unlikely, really, for any vaccine that you're going to get anything close to 100% efficacy. And we're looking at somewhere around 70 to 75% for a vaccine against the pandemic coronavirus, which is good. But you have to look at that in conjunction with the percentage of the population that is going to actually take this vaccine. And right now, preliminary polling is showing that there's a possibility that up to 50% of the population, and this is specific to the United States, wouldn't want to receive this vaccine. And I think that is something that is, important to keep in mind when we talk about how this crisis is going to end. If you don't have a sizable chunk of the population willing to receive a vaccine, that's not ending a crisis. But even on top of that, something that sometimes gets lost in the conversation, because a vaccine has been touted as the solution to all of our problems, is that you can't give a vaccine to a sick person. And right now, the crux of the crisis it's all of the sick people who desperately need medical attention, who need to get out of the hospital as fast as possible, because we're also seeing our hospital capacity dwindle rapidly. So that has overflowing effects on other medical conditions. We've seen a rapid decrease in cancer diagnosis rates, for example, but also limits our ability in just treating the spectrum of patients with COVID-19. And that is the magic of the therapeutic, because you can acutely target the people who are actually sick. You can actually address the crisis at hand. And, if we're looking at a bridge to the future in 2021, when we most likely and hopefully do have options both in the therapeutics front and the vaccine front, you are hopefully giving as many people as possible that vaccine, which prevents people from getting sick. For the people for whom the vaccine doesn't work and they do end up falling sick, you have a therapeutic option once they're in the hospital and need to be treated. And that creates rapid turnover, so you can actually keep treating people in hospitals and actually have a way to manage this on multiple fronts.
Shawnee, so I think at this point, maybe we can shift over and start answering some questions from the audience. Does that sound good?
Yep, that sounds good to me. We'll start with the ones we have, and I'll keep going through.
Do you want to DJ for us?
Yes, I will get to it. Okay, number one, is the government showing any interest in assisting or flat out paying for these antibodies?
No, not yet, and we're working on it. So we're talking with BARDA and the Joint Task Force, and we're also engaging congressional offices, kind of a top-down approach. So we're pushing on all cylinders. I still think it could make sense, and the right people, if we talk, maybe we just haven't talked to the right people yet. We're pushing on that at all fronts. We're not entirely relying on it because we're a little worried that I think we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket on that, because I think we should have been there already, and that's my concern. But it still could definitely happen for us, which would be huge. We're also considering talking, because maybe like Canada has money, so we'll check with them too, right? We'll do everything it takes. I still think it would be great. We're an American company. I think the U.S. could cover this, and it could do good for the United States and do good for the world. So we are optimistic. We're actively engaged. We had positive meetings with BARDA and the FDA, and we're talking to these other groups. But at this point, that has not happened.
Something to add right there is from a federal funding perspective, a lot of the priority has been vaccine development, research and development, and actually even secondary to that, even though it's been explained as a parallel priority, diagnostics. So those have kind of been the two big areas of focus. And when you look at the companies thus far who have received funding from the federal government, you largely see these big conglomerates of pharmaceutical companies, especially in the vaccine space. You're seeing more of the smaller companies and startups on the diagnostics front, but that is a whole nother minefield of interesting issues with emergency authorization when you look at specificity and sensitivity of these tests. But when you look at the therapeutics bucket, that bucket, first of all, has been relatively much smaller, and you're still looking at these big pharmaceutical companies. But as this crisis is evolving, I think we also have seen that the government's response to it is evolving, which is why it's important to keep these conversations going and engage multiple branches and sub branches of our government, because it definitely is quite a complicated system, which can be used to our advantage.
And I was just going to add on to that really quickly. Dr. Scott Gottlieb, as well as Dr. Fauci, in the last couple of weeks have both commented on just the need for an antibody therapeutic, both as a bridge in between now and when we get a vaccine, and just in general as a different approach to treat the virus. So I don't know if you guys had more to say about that, but recent current event.
There we go. So we are, Ashani and I are writing up this op-ed we're getting ready to send out, and we're definitely hammering on that point. So we don't want to be like, putting down the vaccine effort. That is really important. We don't want to empower the anti-vaxxer movement or vaccine skepticism, but we do want to make sure people realize that, like, let's say we get a vaccine, and the smart money is we'll get one. There's 179 that I know of in development. Some of them are pretty far along. So let's say we get one. We know it's not going to be 100%. Fauci said he'd settle, what was it, 70 to 75% efficacy? Yeah, so
yep.
It works on, let's say, 3/4 of people get it. But then we also know that 20 to 50% of Americans, 20% have said there's no way they're taking a vaccine. Another 30% said they're not sure. Maybe they're worried about getting a new one, or they're just not sure. It's harder to give people medicine when they're healthy. When they're sick, they're like, yeah, give me whatever, make me feel better. But when they're healthy, it's harder. But you add those numbers up, and you're talking about, let's say we had a vaccine in 2021 in January. It's that whole year where we're vaccinating people in the United States. And it's not just the United States. You have to vaccinate the whole world, because otherwise we're just going to keep infecting each other, which means there's a whole year at least where there's going to be people that keep going to be getting sick. We've infected right now about 5% of the population with this thing on average. That means 95% of the problem is still ahead of us, and we're going to impact our hospitals all year long. We need a medicine. And I think we're trying to make sure that they're not, nobody's susceptible to magical thinking to be like, the minute a vaccine pops up, everything's good, because that's not true. You're talking about at least a year, and it might be forever, or longer, depending on how many people receive an effective vaccine. And so I think that's part of what we're trying to articulate with that op-ed, without knocking we want the vaccines. I will take the vaccine. But I also want to know that if the vaccine doesn't work for me, or if it hasn't popped up yet, and that I can go and I get sick, I can go into a hospital and there's something for me there to make me get better faster.
Yep, I think that covers that one. On to the next. Okay, so number 2, wouldn't a state like California have financial interest? And I'm happy to start with this one. So this is definitely a question that speaks to just the structure of American government as a whole. It is a system of federalism, which means you have your national government and you have your state governments. And each, I mean, obviously they work together relatively extensively, but each does have its own jurisdiction per se. And that has to relate with, things affecting multiple states versus things just affecting one state. And obviously this pandemic is not only a national, but also a global crisis. So you are typically seeing the national government take the lead. And that is really where your money is coming from, because the national government is also the part of our government that has budget flexibility. Your state governments do not have as much budget flexibility as your national government does. They do have some, but this is not like an area where states are going to be funding solutions. What you do see, though, from the state level is funding contact tracing and a lot of different technology to facilitate rapid response and active crisis mitigation. The funding that's coming from the national government is for solutions that are a little bit more long-term and broad spectrum. So that is the differentiation. However, this pandemic has been interesting in the sense that states have taken the lead in a lot of policy and scientific arenas, especially when you look at diagnostics, for example. I think New York and California are 2 really big examples of that. But short answer being, a therapeutic or vaccine or any real like medical intervention is on a scale that is kind of beyond the capability of a state government. That being said, obviously it's important to engage all parts of our government because that is what a crisis needs. But yeah, that's the deal with California versus our national government. Anything to add?
We can shake Gavin down for 8 million. I think you're probably right. His federal is the right way to go. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Number 3, related to funding as well. BARDA gave Regeneron $450 million recently. Any way that you can get a significant infusion of cash?
Yeah. The bank accounts are open. We're welcome to receive it. So we are talking, we don't need 450 million. We do need, like I said, about 8 million. Really, I'd ask for about 10 because there's various logistical overhead things. And we're also trying to do some work with this company called SwiftScale. I'd like to be able to support their manufacturing strategy. And then our clinical studies were, Stephanie, it was about 48 million, somewhere in that arena, like around 50 million was somewhere in that arena. I can't remember if that also included the manufacturing or that was separate.
Hard to remember now because we revised it a couple times, but the point is it's much less than 450 million.
So we do, ideally government would give this to us. And BARDA, we're having conversations with them. They may release these funds to us, but that hasn't happened at this point. And we're talking to other agencies. I see the next question. I'll just answer it now. It says international funding. Yes, we are. At this point, we're going to reach out to other countries, but for 2 reasons. One is we want to distribute. The other is that they potentially have resources. Now, typically, if I was a government, I would prefer to give a grant to a company from my own nation. I don't know if that's a strict requirement, but I suspect that's a preference because you're enriching your own biotechnology industry. That's caused us to think about some interesting ways to finance this thing, which would include a sort of a contract we could engage with nations where they could perform the manufacturing and production of the drug in their nation. And so it's essentially sort of like an authorized license for nationalization of production where we get a certain amount of payments out for doses produced. These are things we're contemplating, and but these conversations are open and flexible. It's fair to say that we're early on in them, but this is sort of what we're spending time thinking about. So we're definitely starting to have these meetings and try to figure out, is there creative solutions that would enable those governments to be able to have access to the medicine easily and produce it, and then us to be able to have some resources necessary to go prove it out going forward and risk share globally.
A related question that came in was that it seems like the government might be more apt to provide funding once you have some human efficacy data to show. For example, Regeneron, would you agree? I think Jake is a good person to answer this, but the quick thing that I would add is that there is, to my knowledge, it's not efficacy data from humans that Regeneron had, it was safety data, and that's kind of like the differentiation between space trials. But yeah, I think Jake, you can speak to how this process of meetings and acquiring funding works.
So
Stephanie, of course.
The universal truth is that yes, everybody wants to have all reward and no risk. So it's definitely going to be the case that everyone would like to have all the answers first before they put the money in, but it's a chicken and egg problem because we need the money to get the answers. Regeneron has no efficacy data. No company currently does. What they probably have is human safety data, which is that they put the antibodies into people and nothing happened, which is almost always what happens when you put antibodies into people if it's not targeting a self tissue. Antibodies are typically very safe. That's part of the reason why these are good choices. But yeah, they've managed to go run phase 1 studies. We think that they probably managed to do that. So they, and then also Abcelera, to their credit, managed to move very quickly with their antibodies, pop them in, and get some phase 1 safety data. They probably had to go through 2 different tracks of manufacture to do that, where they did the early phase 1 with one manufacturing strategy, and then they shifted gears, which took some months for follow-on. This is a guess, but that's our understanding of how that probably took place. Which mostly then that's a PR advantage, but I'm not detracting. We want them to be successful, and we're glad that they move quickly. Our strategy is that those guys were funded quickly. They have molecules moving forward. They're going to probably be the first in class to determine whether they see efficacy data, and we'll learn something from that. So if they see no benefit, we're going to think very carefully about whether there's some biology that they weren't realizing that might affect our program as well. If they see some benefit, then we think our antibodies are more potent in there. So our drug should be even better, and that's good news for us. In general, like when we look back to the Ebola crisis, there were kind of 3 tracks of antibodies that went into Ebola patients. There was the ZMapp, which it didn't really work that well. It wasn't very stable, but it proved the principle that an antibody could protect against Ebola, which was great because Ebola used to be kind of where we are now, where there was no effective therapy. But the next antibodies, one that came out of the NIH and then one that came from Regeneron, they worked much better. And so the best in class emerged later. Although I'll say that Regeneron's antibody for Ebola, you had to put 150 mg per kg. That's like a toothpaste tube full of antibody into a person, which was crazy, too high. And it's partially because Ebola, again, is sort of a neglected tropical disease. So it wasn't worth refining and optimizing those antibodies for that application. Their strategy was like, well, let's just dose like crazy. That's you can basically have a weaker antibody do its job by just giving a much higher dose. And so that's how they handled it. But the point is, the later antibodies ended up being the best in class. And so that's what we're intending to do here as well.
Alrighty, for a slightly more scientific question, do you know if your drug protects or cures other coronaviruses?
It's easy. No, we have no idea, and I suspect not. So the antibody hits a very specific location. So the coronavirus is surrounded by a series of spikes, and it uses those spikes to tear open the membranes of your lung tissue cells and other cells and inject its genetic information to infect the cell. If you zoomed into the spike, you would see it look kind of like an orange street cone with like 3 oranges floating around on strings on top of it, or 3 little orange balloons. The orange balloons are called the receptor binding domains, and those actually are what stick onto some receptors on your cells. Our antibodies go and they block that part of the spike so that the spike is no longer able to stab and infect the cells. So they make the virus no longer infectious. The spot where our antibodies bind is very specific, designed to block what's called the ACE2 interaction site. We took our lead antibody, which is Centivax. We took that from an anti-SARS antibody that was discovered almost 20 years ago, and we adapted it to now specifically recognize the novel coronavirus. So it looks like it will recognize this coronavirus, but the other coronaviruses are so different at that site that I don't think this antibody would provide productive protection against them.
So yeah, definitely related, but like you said, productive prevention or protection. The broad spectrum question, I think that's probably what it's stemming from. That pertains more to our universal flu vaccine work. That's kind of the class of influenza broad spectrum solution.
We do have.
All right.
It's worth mentioning that we do have some antibodies we found that were broad spectrum against the receptor binding domain, but I haven't actually spent that much time focusing on them because I looked, and SARS is so different from the novel coronavirus and is so different than MERS that if another coronavirus pops up, it's going to be quite different from all of those. And we actually don't know. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. We won't know how it's changed. And because we have three examples, and they're all pretty far apart in sequence space. Trying to guess how a new coronavirus shows up is going to be difficult. And so my feeling was it's better just to do a knockout punch against the current coronavirus, make an excellent medicine to solve the current crisis, and then we could begin exploring, if provided I have resources, to do some tech dev on like basically creating a displayed, give me a second, sorry, I'm gonna move over. It's the construction happening in my apartment. I'm getting blasted with lead dust and I do not desire that. We could display a polymorphism library of possible versions of the receptor binding domain where we have tens of millions of possible mutational variants, and then select them against ACE2 to identify which variants are not tolerated if the virus is still to engage ACE2. And then from that polymorphic pool, we could recover an antibody that binds the conserved site that is not allowed to change. Through that mechanism, we could discover a broadly neutralizing antibody against a site that is resistant to change by virtue of its necessity of engaging the receptor, even though we don't know what those future viruses look like. So that in theory is possible, but we're not doing any of that stuff right now. We're working on making a cure for the current coronavirus, and then I can play those fun games in the future once the world's back to normal, our grandmas are safe, and I can go back to Hawaii.
Yep, that indeed. All right, next question. How are the blood plasma protocols going in partnership with Guatemala?
Cool. If you are interested in the blood plasma protocols, you should tune in tomorrow. It's up on all of our socials. Sarah Ives is giving her presentation, and I think there's going to be a special announcement to the University of San Carlos. It's broadcasted throughout Latin America and the United States. She's speaking in English, and I think there's going to be a Spanish translator, and she's going to give an update on the assays. So for everyone's benefit, what we've been doing is with Aaron Calgua at the University of San Carlos, we've been working with them to try to help out in creating a convalescent plasma transfer protocol. So they already have that set up at the Roosevelt Hospital in Guatemala and some other hospitals. What they don't have, and in general across Latin America and other parts of the world, is an ability to tell which blood samples have the good antibodies and which don't. So you've probably heard on the news that about 20% of people aren't making any antibodies at all, and of the 80% of people who do after they're infected, some are definitely making better antibodies than others. So the exercise is, how do you find the good blood? And that's what Sarah Ives is working on, is she's partnering up with the University of San Carlos to use a simple type of experiment called an ELISA that's relatively inexpensive and could be run anywhere around the world to rapidly determine which blood samples have strong antibodies to the receptor binding domain, that thing I was just talking about, because that's sort of your best, relatively low tech, relatively high throughput way to be able to identify the better plasma from the worst plasma and triage to make sure that you're giving patients the best antibodies that you could. And the really cool thing about this is the University of San Carlos then wants to be able to share this protocol, open source it, so that anyone around the world who's interested could start applying this method. And I think this will result in producing better plasma transferred to more patients. And you can find out about tomorrow on exactly where she is. She's giving a 45-minute seminar.
And all the information of that is all on our social media channels. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, you can definitely find it all over there.
Centivax, you'll find it.
Yep. All right. Next question. Do recent reports of reinfection pose difficulty when considering vaccine reliability?
Okay, so I actually think no. I have a lot of thoughts on this. Some of them are substantiated, some of them aren't. And Aishani and I had interesting conversation on decision on how much we talk about this in our op-ed. Sorry, let me just sit down here. Sorry, guys. The apartment, they're doing lead remediation, and they just put like a tube through the window, and then they smiled at me, and suddenly a bunch of dust blasted out of it, and I'm like, no. So over here. Where was I? Yes. So when people are naturally infected, afterwards when they recover, there have been some reports of people that could get infected again, or some people that don't have antibodies after infection. So as an immunologist, first off, I will readily admit we don't have all the data. That said, the existing information suggests that most people do produce antibodies. They do wane, but that's true for flu shots and flu. It does appear that people have some immunity. There is a concern of how long does it last? Does it look like it dropped within 3 months? And I think what we don't know is how much antibody is enough to protect you. That's an open question of what's the level that's too low for protection. The other thing that's missing there is you don't just have antibodies, you have T cells, and those aren't being tested carefully, but there clearly is some other type of immunity because we have people who have no antibodies and they have no symptoms. There's a second type of immunity, probably T cells protecting them. But that is natural infection. So when the virus infects you naturally, it's doing a bunch of nasty bad things to try to inhibit your immune system from producing a productive immune response. When you're getting a vaccine, you're not being exposed to the virus in the normal way it would be exposed to. So the kind of immunity and how long you get your antibodies are going to be more of a function of the adjuvants and the property of the vaccine rather than the property of a live viral infection. So just because people have short immunity to the live infection, that doesn't mean that they would necessarily have short immunity to a vaccine, because the vaccine at this point is just proteins, and it's the whole virus and all the creepy things it's doing to your immune system that could give rise to a shortened immune response. Like, we know that T cells are dropped in a lot of recovered patients. So it probably is messing with our immune system in some funky way, and that's not going to happen in the same way with a vaccine. So that's not to say vaccines are going to be effective either. I think the latest I've seen is the Moderna and the BioNTech vaccines are giving rise to antibodies are being produced. The people are having side effects. So they're having like fevers and other stuff. That's not great. I don't want to have a bunch of side effects. But on the other hand, the fact that you're having a side effect means your immune system's responding. So that to me means that the immunity that's developed from those things, I think, is probably going to be a different time course compared to natural immunity. I think we have the open question for both vaccines and natural immunity is how much antibody is enough. And we just don't know that the answer to that question yet. We should know it soon, because people should be tracking like a whole bunch of hospital staff. That's where we should be getting those results from. I'm sure somebody is running those studies right now.
I think that Mount Sinai is doing a seroprevalence study and tracking exactly those metrics just to see how long antibodies remain in the blood and remain effective against neutralizing the coronavirus. The other thing to note is that when you're talking about length of immunity, that's mostly with respect to a vaccine or a natural infection. When you're talking about the infusion of an antibody therapeutic, that's typically something, there's a metric called half-life of how long this thing lasts in your blood. We're looking at about 8 weeks, and also have done some additional engineering to try to maximize that as much as possible from a therapeutic standpoint.
The natural coronaviruses that cause, these are distant relatives of SARS-CoV-2. There are these other coronaviruses that cause what feels like a common cold. Those were studied for people, tracked how long people had immunity to those, and it looked like you'd have about a year of immunity, but that immunity would also wane. So it could be a property of the coronaviruses that they're pretty good at kind of messing with your immune system, so you don't have a long, it's not like chickenpox where you have like lifelong or near lifelong immunity. It seems like it does wear off faster.
And the other thing to note is for what Jake mentioned earlier about T cell depletion as a possible thing of consideration. That is something that has been differentiated between some of our more severe cases versus the moderate and mild cases. And there's just a lot of ongoing research about how much the immune response to the infection contributes to some of these responses that we're seeing versus the virus itself. But I think on to the next question. All right. Will your medicine be able to take as an option after it passes clinical trials, or do you have to have a certain number pre-ordered before it's available to the public?
I mean, no, we're basically, as soon as we see efficacy in phase 2, we're going to start pressing every button we can to try to get the medicine out to people who need it. So that includes compassionate use, expanded access, and also emergency authorization. So our intention and what first off, the way the BARDA's pitch to us and others is that they want to have solutions that can make a medicine and also have like 100,000 doses available right away. And what we would do is build up those doses on speculation. So at risk, while we're running the manufacturing for the study, we would also produce a lot of extra doses so that as soon as we know that this thing's looking good, we hand out those doses right away and we start manufacturing more. We do not want a delay between approval and availability. That happened at one point during the Ebola outbreak, where there was a 4-month delay where ZMapp ran out of medicine, and that's ridiculous. We can't run into a situation like that. So we are working hard to solve that problem. Once we have a revenue stream, we are self-sustainable and we're no longer answerable to, the time frames of granting agencies. But we do want someone to help us prime that pump. And again, I'll believe it when I see it, but I think there's a lot of nations out there and they all have a vested interest in having a medicine available. If they all chip in on this collective goods problem, we'll be able to produce lots of doses.
Yeah, I would just chime in and add on to that, you know, producing at risk is a good strategy, you know, for keeping people safe, but it definitely requires a substantial amount of financing. The manufacturing aspect of development is not an insubstantial cost. So, and especially doing it for doses to be ready and to be given to people. So that's definitely something we're thinking a lot about.
Yep. And to add one last point to that, if you look at vaccine development and funding thus far, all of this manufacturing is going at substantial financial risk to a lot of these pharmaceutical companies and the government itself, which just speaks to how acute of a crisis this is, because that is extremely, extremely rare. And, you know, typical workflows, the time that it takes to manufacture, that's why, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, you really are looking at 10 years of R&D before you actually have a drug on shelves that, you know, you can then exploit the remaining 10 years of your patent and make money off of that drug. So definitely a lot of the conventional rules about how funding and manufacturing and timelines work are being thrown out the window because of how severe of a crisis this is, but there definitely are still a lot of limiting factors that do need to be taken into account. All right, on to the next one. Let's see. Would you recommend a flu vaccine and a COVID vaccine once available if one has a poor immune system?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, take them both.
I think, you know, sometimes because we've talked a lot about our universal flu vaccine previously, which is a separate project from our COVID-19 antibody. And also previously because there's been comparisons in the media between the two viruses, it's important to just keep in mind they are not the same thing. They are two distinct families of viruses, even though some of the symptoms are comparable. They are different molecularly and in all other respects. So that's, you know, not something that can be conflated into one. All right.
Is that what the purpose of the question was? Yeah.
Yeah, that was the purpose of the question, I think.
Our broad spectrum flu shot will protect against lots of different versions of flu, but it will not, like Ashani was saying, it was not going to be able to protect against other unrelated viruses.
All right. Next question. Have you targeted talking to politicians who are /were doctors? You might have an easier time speaking to them than bureaucrats. I'll start off with this question. So as we mentioned briefly earlier, we're talking to all of the relevant agencies, including BARDA, for example, and then of course the FDA because of important regulatory restrictions. But we also have been talking to various congressional offices, which has been helpful because, you know, these various parts of government do all play off of each other. But at the end of the day, they're just levers and you still have to wait and see results. I think everybody is focused on trying to mitigate this crisis as best as possible. But there are, you know, it's at the end of the day, government is an institution and things take time and communication needs to happen. And I think there definitely have been a lot of people who have been very helpful, but things need to continue to play out and we need to keep working at it. So short answer, yes. Long answer, still working on it. I don't see any other questions. There have been a few suggestions about talking to professional sports leagues in Hollywood because COVID-19 does affect, you know, timelines for that. And, you know, I think that just speaks to we are being creative with exploring our funding options, but ongoing development, and we will keep everyone posted. But I don't have anything else. Jake and Stephanie?
I think that's it. Thanks, folks. If you think of any other questions, go ahead and shoot them out. If you want to help us out, share this. You found this interesting, share it with other people. We want to amplify the message right now. We're trying to get this out to the world, particularly if you know folks that are influencing financial decisions here in the United States or internationally, because at this point we want to be able to speak to many nations. So if you have friends or you come from another country where you feel like we should be talking to them, please put us in touch.
And I would just add one last thing on top of that, which is just to say that if you're the biggest source of your exposure to biotech has been Centivax, my point would just be that Centivax is extremely unique in all things biotech and in pharma, but even within startup companies that are going after new medicines, their business model of low price, bootstrapping, all of that is, even Jake has a strategy of going into the veterinary market. This is all very unconventional, and his approach to it is very unconventional. And I think that that is a huge advantage that we have, but it's also something to consider that we are figuring out a lot of things that other biotechs don't figure out because they do it a different way. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Next time we tune in, we'll probably have the bioinformatic teams come in and talk about the computational optimization of some of our antibody leads and some of the work done by Aishani and JP and some of our other team members on that front. All right. Before we go, I want to bring up Jan to be able to say thanks for Apex doing all of these awesome podcasts. And so this awesome streaming across like multiple different platforms simultaneously. If you're listening to us right now, it's because he's enabled it. So thank you to Apex.
Thank you.
You got a haircut. Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.